All right, it is 12 o'clock, so we are going to get started. Thank you so much for joining us, and welcome to our first installment of our 2023 Ask the Alliance webinar series. My name is Adam Miller, and I am our communications director here at the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, and I'm so excited to be talking to you today about fly fishing, something that's near and dear to my heart, one of my favorite things to do. It's a wonderful way to connect with your local watershed and really appreciate the intricacies of our aquatic ecosystems. So, a few notes before we get started. If you wish to have your camera on, you can turn it on, but please try to keep yourself muted so that we can hear the presentation today. We will be collecting your questions to answer at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to comment them in the chat while they're fresh in your mind, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation today. So before we get started, I just want to give a quick introduction to the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay for all of you who are joining us for the first time. The Alliance was founded in 1971, and we're a nonprofit organization that restores the lands and waters of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. Our collaborative and action-oriented approach delivers on-the-ground solutions, technical assistance, and builds capacity to achieve healthier lands and cleaner water. So for us, that's all about working upstream to build resiliency on the land for long-term improvement to water quality in our communities. And in order to do that, we have 4 offices that are strategically chosen within, strategically chosen areas of the watershed. We're headquartered in Annapolis, and we have offices in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Richmond, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. We do our work in 4 main program areas of agriculture, forest, green infrastructure, and stewardship and engagement. And each of these programs is also designed to bring much needed solutions to the problems that affect the Chesapeake Bay downstream. If you're interested in learning more about our work, I strongly encourage you to visit our website, which is full of information about our team, our strategy, and our projects. Here on my screen, I'm sharing a link to our volunteer page and a QR code that will take you to our volunteer page. If you're interested in getting involved in our work, our volunteer page lists out all of the events that allow you to join us in the field to learn more about our work, help us plant trees, maintain trees, clean up our neighborhoods, and so much more. And so I strongly encourage you to visit that page and potentially join our Confluence, our monthly newsletter, where you can stay up to date with all of the things that are happening in the way of the Alliance and around the watershed in general. So for the next few weeks, we're going to be bringing you some exciting presentations from our passionate staff here at the Alliance. Every Thursday, July through August 24th, our team of experts here at the Alliance will be sharing their passion for topics such as visual storytelling in nature, converting lawn to native meadow habitat, long-distance kayaking, foraging, macroinvertebrates, which we talk a little bit about today, DIY rain gardens, and turtles of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And I really can't say enough about the passion for our staff in general here at the Alliance, but through these topics, we're tapping into many of the things that drive our staff to want to protect our amazing watershed. And so I hope that you all consider visiting the Ask the Alliance page and signing up for more of our presentations if you haven't already. So let's talk about one of the things that really drives me to care about protecting our Chesapeake Bay watershed. For most of my life, fishing has been the vehicle that drove me to develop a deep connection with our watershed. I grew up in and still live in South Central Pennsylvania in a family that showed me the importance of the outdoors and spending time there. And as you can see from the photos around this slide, now my wife Annie and I have 2 kids, and we're working hard to instill that passion into them by getting them out on the water and spending time fishing together. So we're a pretty fishy family. More evidence to that is we've got a bird dog who's pretty good at hunting, but he enjoys fishing more than he likes hunting. So we like to spend time on the water for sure. A little bit more about my journey. So here I am, little kid with my Shamu fishing rod and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles t-shirt there in the upper left-hand corner. I spin fished for stock trout and largemouth bass through most of my mid-20s. In my mid to late 20s, I picked up a fly rod that my dad gave me, and the rest is really kind of history. I fell in love with the beauty of wild trout and the places that they call home through fly fishing and eventually through fly tying. I developed a passion for the source of food that trout eat and that fish eat in the form of macroinvertebrates. And then I really came to understand that the fish and the bugs that they eat need healthy water and ultimately need streamside forests in order to survive. And so through all that, I really came to understand and love the greater watershed that I call home here in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And so in short, I'm here at the Alliance giving this presentation today because of the connection that I found to our watershed through fly fishing. So when most people think about fly fishing, they probably picture something like this scene from A River Runs Through It with Brad Pitt standing in a beautiful Montana stream, making a long cast with his bamboo fly rod and vintage creel and classic fishing hat. And they probably think of trout fishing. But this is what I think about when I think about fly fishing. I think about anglers of all ages catching 11 species of fish in 3 different states, with the two furthest away pins being over 350 miles apart. I'm going to keep talking about some of the fish on this slide, but while I do, if anybody has any guesses as to how many species of fish live in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, please feel free to comment your guesses in the chat while I'm talking about these fish. So in the upper left-hand corner, we've got a big wild brown trout that was caught in Mifflin County, Pennsylvania. Moving over to the right, we have a native brook trout that was caught in Elk County, Pennsylvania. This smallmouth bass was caught in a stream in Lycoming County just this past weekend. And a little bit later on in the presentation, I have a photograph of the fly that I tied last week to catch that fish with, and I'll point it out when we get there. This is a photo of our son holding a yellow perch that he caught up in the Poconos, a brown trout that my son caught on Penns Creek, a rainbow trout that my wife caught. Here we have a creek chub caught by a friend of mine on his very first fly fishing outing ever. This is our Pennsylvania and Ag Program Director, Jenna Mitchell Beckett, who is holding a shad that she caught in Northern Maryland. Everybody should know this one. We've got a striped bass, a rockfish, depending on where you're from, that was caught on the bay. A white perch, a sucker. There's lots of species of fish that can be caught on a fly rod, and a sucker is one of them. Another native brook trout caught in the mountains of West Virginia. Another wild brown trout caught in Northern Maryland. Bluegill that was caught in Pennsylvania, and then another wild brown trout that was caught in the mountains of Pennsylvania. So many species of fish that are available to catch on a fly rod. And so many of the species that live here will eat a fly for us if we do it right. So looks like we've got a guess here in the chat of 104. They're actually just shy of 350 species of fish in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And like I said, many of them are willing to eat a fly for us, even like a sucker on this slide. The main point that I really want to get across here is that fly fishing is for everyone, and it can be done just about anywhere. It's not an elite club. You don't have to look or dress a certain way in order to spend time on the water with a fly rod. And no matter where someone lives in the watershed, there's a fish for people to develop a connection with. Most importantly, it's a lot of fun. I mean, when I look at some of the smiles on this slide, I'm seeing some of my most memorable days over the course of the past couple of years. So just a few disclaimers before we get started. Fly fishing isn't really the type of activity that you can master by watching a single presentation. My goal today is to introduce you to the gear and techniques and break down some of the complexities and hopefully just inspire you to give fly fishing a shot. It can appear really complicated at face value. I'm going to do my best to keep things simple and straightforward. So let's get into it. I think that most of us are probably pretty familiar with the type of rod that's pictured here on this slide. It's what I grew up using, and it's a very effective way to fish. I still fish with a spin fishing rod. Because it's something that many of us are probably at least a little bit familiar with, it makes a good point of reference for us to begin to understand fly fishing. So let's take a look at some of the differences between fly gear and spin fishing gear. So on the top, we have a fly rod and reel set up with an assortment of flies underneath of it. And then on the bottom, we have a spin fishing rod and reel with an assortment of lures. I'm going to pause just for 20 seconds or so. What are some of the main differences that you all might notice about but between these two types of setups? You can put them in the chat. Flies are fluffier. Size of the lines. Good observation. That's going to play into something that I want to talk about. The reel is longer. That's great. Different locations on the reel is a good call as well. So yeah, there are lots of differences just in appearance between these two rigs. There's two differences, and you all got them both that I really want to highlight. So I'm glad. Um, the line is significantly thicker. The diameter of the line on the fly rod is significantly thicker than I'm used to seeing on a typical spin fishing reel. And then the flies themselves appear like they're made out of different types of material than I'm accustomed to seeing hanging on the shelves of a sporting goods store. So let's take a closer look at, well, first of all, so basically in fly fishing, what we're doing is we use the weight of heavy line to cast light flies. And so you said that the flies are fluffier. You said that the line looks thicker. The line is heavier, the flies are lighter, and we're using that heavy line to propel light flies. Whereas in spin fishing, we're typically using the weight of heavier lures to cast light line. So now let's take a look at the differences a little bit closer. So on the left-hand side, we've got an assortment of lures in my hand, as well as some pretty thin standard fluorocarbon fishing line that's kind of laying across those lures on the left-hand side. And then on the right-hand side is an assortment of flies, and you can see a much heavier fly fishing line laying across my hand with those flies. So the lures on the left are made out of heavier materials, metal, hard and soft plastic. They've got weight to them, and they're easier for us to cast with that light line. The flies on the left are made out of things like fur and feathers and hair, synthetic materials like foam. In most cases, they're very light. They're not very aerodynamic. The wind messes with us and makes it difficult to propel them forward. And so we need that heavier weight fly line in order to push them forward. And so for these reasons, the way that we cast a fly rod is one of the most unique things to this style of fishing. And while there are many ways to cast both spin fishing rods and fly rods, for this presentation, we're going to focus on the basics of fly casting. So once again, I just want to quickly compare fly casting to spin casting because I think it's something that many of us are probably familiar with. And so in this illustration, this is what it looks like when we're typically casting a fishing rod. The angler has very little line out. They maneuver the rod back over their shoulder, and note how even in this illustration, you can see that there's weight to that lure that's starting to bend the tip of the rod down. And then in step two, they quickly bring that rod forward and bring it to an abrupt stop. The weight of the lure flies out into the water, carries a bunch of very lightweight line with it, and the angler completes their cast. So if we tried to do this with our lightweight flies, and we try to use this gear and this technique with those lightweight flies, the fly would probably not get very far. We would probably have some sort of bird's nest occurring on our spin fishing reel, and it would be a mess. And so that's why most fishing looks a lot different than this famous photo of Brad Pitt playing Paul McLean and a river runs through it, right? He's, got all this line in the air. What's all that about? So let's take a look at what a typical fly cast looks like, and explore why fly anglers always look like they're waving a bunch of line around in the air. So we're going to break the fly cast down into two main sections with 9 individual steps. You could do more than this, you could do less than this. These are just the ones that I chose to highlight today. And again, perfecting this cast is something that takes time and practice, and it's best to do it hands-on. But if you understand the basic physics and of casting and break down the cast into some digestible bites, a new fly angler can get on the water, have fun, and catch fish without being a physicist. It's not all that hard. And there are ways that you can get out there and fish without being a perfect caster. So step one, B1, back cast step number 1. You've got the fly line on the water in front of you. It's laying on the water's surface, and the rod is parallel to the water's surface. On a clock, the rod tip is pointed at the 9. In step B2, the angler begins to lift the line off the water by quickly moving the rod tip upwards. Between step B1 and B4, our goal is to accelerate the rod as smoothly as possible. So we want to kind of start slow and speed up. And then we'll talk about some of the additional steps as we get closer to them. When the fly rod reaches directly overhead, or what would be like 12 o'clock on a clock, you can start to see how the weight of that weighted fly line is causing the rod to flex. And we call this loading the rod. This is part of the physics of the cast. In step B4, the angler brings that smooth acceleration from B1 to a stop. We're talking about like roughly 2 o'clock on a clock. That can change depending on the types of flies and the type of rod that we're casting, but 2 o'clock on the clock is a good place to really bring that smooth acceleration to an abrupt stop. As the rod stops, that energy from the loaded rod unloads and propels the fly line backwards. And that abrupt stop is what causes the abrupt unloading of the fly rod and propulsion of the line backwards over our head. At B5, we want to pause for a second and wait as the fly line straightens out and becomes parallel to the ground behind us. And then just as, depending, on lots of different scenarios, as the line becomes straight and parallel to the ground behind us, we want to repeat this process in the opposite direction. We start with smooth acceleration forward, and you can see the rod beginning to load again under the tension of the heavy line and the momentum that the line had going backwards. As the fly rod begins to gain forward momentum, we've got more loading from the weight of the fly line taking place. And then once again, a crisp, abrupt stop when we reach about that 10 o'clock point, and that line is going to just roll out nicely in front of us. And the energy is going to transfer straight out, propel the line forward. And as that line straightens out, becomes parallel to the water, we want to very slowly and gently just kind of lower our rod tip straight down to the water and allow everything to kind of land in one uniform piece. So that's pretty much the complete casting stroke. That's simplifying it into, a level of simplicity that's much more difficult to understand when you're standing there with a fly rod in your hand. But we're recording this presentation. You can come back to this, check out these steps, and I promise you that if you just think about the physics involved with loading that rod, the smooth acceleration, the abrupt stop, and those points on the clock, you're going to get the job done more than well enough to go out there and have fun and catch a fish. And the rest comes with time. The only other thing I want to say about this is if you spend time watching a fly angler casting, you might say like, well, don't they sometimes like repeat this step a whole bunch of times before they even cast? Sometimes it seems like we spend more time with our line in the air than on the water. And the answer is yeah, there's times where you would want to do something like change the direction of your cast. So maybe we started facing downstream and we want to make our cast upstream. We might need to repeat this process a few times to make that turn as we're repeating the process. You might also want to let more line out of the guides, or you might want to dry off your dry fly, and repeating this casting stroke a few times will allow you to do all of those things. When you want to do that, you would basically get yourself to step F4. You would skip B1, go back to B2. So just kind of like on our backstroke at B5 and F1, we paused for a second, allowed things to lay out, and then we restarted the process. You would do that again at F4. You'd let things lay out straight, and you'd start to repeat the motion again at B2. But to be honest, most of the time when we're getting started, we can probably do one or two of these false casts, as we call them, and get our line on the water. There's no fish up in the air. There's certainly no fish in the trees where our fly is going to end up if we do this too much and flail around too much. And so it's best just to get our fly on the water, try to catch some fish. I appreciate that there's questions rolling in. So my team's gathering those up and putting them into a sheet for me to answer at the end. So keep them coming. So let's talk about flies real quick. There's many different types of flies designed to mimic different types of insects and fish. We've got streamers up here on the top, bait, crayfish, other forms of large food, top water, which would be terrestrials, frogs, mice, and wounded fish. Dry flies, which would be the winged adult form of aquatic insects. This is probably what most people think of when they think of fly fishing. And then we've got nymphs down there in the lower right-hand corner, which is the underwater stage of aquatic insects. Some flies are big, like this two-hooked articulated bass fly that I tied last week. This is the one that I mentioned caught that smallmouth bass up on Pine Creek in north central Pennsylvania this past weekend. Some flies are tiny, like this little dry fly. This is like a size 22 dry fly that's sitting on top of a penny here. Some of them are realistic, like these three flies that are designed to mimic the different seasonal colors of a crayfish. And some of them are not designed to match a specific critter, like this wild black and purple and pink baitfish pattern. This is a great time to answer a question that came in during our registration process. Somebody asked, what are some good color options for Chesapeake Bay streamer patterns? You're always going to have the traditional contrast colors that everybody likes, like white and chartreuse. And you'll hear the saying, if it ain't chartreuse, it ain't no use. There's truth to that. I love white and chartreuse flies. I love flies that mimic the colors of things like perch or baby smallmouth bass, like that articulated fly that I showed a couple minutes ago. But there's a running joke in the fly fishing world that black and purple are terrible choices for fly colors. And all three of these fish, the flounder, the weak fish, and then the striper over there on the right, were all caught on some form of black and purple streamer in the bay or in saltwater pretty close to the bay. So big fan in the bay and in the salt of black and purple. So earlier in my presentation, I shared that as I became more interested in fly fishing, I developed a connection with the places that fish live and the different species of macroinvertebrates that fish feed on. Another question that we had during registration is one that's near and dear to my heart. They ask, why is the eastern green draycatch such a big deal? And, I wanted to answer this question because it really explores an intersection between our work at the Alliance and fly fishing. So most species of aquatic macroinvertebrates, such as mayflies, are pretty intolerant to pollution. They require very specific types of environment to survive. The specifics of these environments can include water quality, water temperature, and can even get as nuanced as requiring a specific blend of leaves from trees, from specific trees. And if you want to learn more about that, we've got our macroinvertebrate presentation for Ask the Alliance coming up later on in the month. So I would check that out if you're fascinated by these bugs like I am. But the life cycle of these bugs is just fascinating to me. Some spend anywhere from months to years growing underwater in their nymph form before they emerge. On the left-hand side, we've got an eastern green drake dun. So they hatch, they look like this. This is a big female dun. And then on the right-hand side, there's a white male spinner. So they spent 2 years underwater as an eastern green drake, growing as a nymph and getting ready for this moment where they hatch. They turn into a dun. They fly around for a day or two, and then they shed their skin and turn into the spinner on the right hand side. They mate, they lay their eggs on the water, and they start the whole cycle over again. And this has been happening for hundreds of thousands of years. There's lots of new evidence as to the age of this mayfly process, and it's incredibly old, and it's beautiful. Like, it's a beautiful reminder of how intricate and fleeting and fragile and worth protecting our ecosystems can be. So that's why the eastern green drake catch is so important to me. It's very limited, happens in central Pennsylvania, western Maryland, few other small places in our watershed, but it's very limited. It happens, you got to, like, use your vacation time and run around the watershed to try to intersect with it, and it's very cool and it's very neat. And this is what a fly, to wrap up the fly portion of this presentation, this is what a fly would look like to mimic that eastern green drake done there. With that being said, you don't need to use all your vacation time and drive around the watershed chasing mayfly hatches to enjoy fly fishing. Another great question asked during event registration was, are there some types of water that are more suited for fly fishing, like creeks versus rivers versus a lake? So remember this graphic that I shared earlier. These fish were caught in all different types of water, ranging from private farm ponds to public access ponds in state parks to small mountain creeks, large rivers, the Chesapeake Bay itself. The thing I love the most about fly fishing is it requires you to think like a fish. Where are they located in the water that you're fishing? Why are they there? That's usually for food or for shelter. In order to be consistently successful while fly fishing, you need to understand their food source, and figuring that puzzle out is one of my favorite things about fly fishing in general. In streams and rivers, trout are often feeding on macroinvertebrates, aquatic bugs, and those bugs need oxygen, so they're found in fast-moving water like riffles. So drifting a nymph through, fast-moving water is going to be a successful way to catch trout. Let's say you're pursuing rockfish on the bay. They're going to be eating bait fish like menhaden. Be best to use a fly that imitates those, and it'd be best to figure out where the bait's at. Where are areas where bait might accumulate and then also get confused and washed around in changing currents. That would be a great place to go pursue striper. So there's often signs that we can use, where birds flocking to the surface of the water, bugs flying around in the air, birds chasing those bugs. You could find bugs stuck in spider webs. I always like to check the underside of leaves on a tree to see if there's any mayflies on the underside of the leaves in the spring and in the summer. A good pair of polarized sunglasses can go a long way in helping us find fish. All this being said, very few areas in the watershed where we can't do a little observation and find a fish and trick it into eating a fly. So let's talk about gear real quick. I could talk about gear for the entire length of this presentation. When you get into fly fishing, the amount of gear choices and the price tags associated with them can be very overwhelming. It's easy to get sucked into ads and articles and influencers that are touting all the latest and greatest stuff. On the left, here's me a decade deep into my fly fishing journey, with waders and boots and a rod and reel, a chest pack, all the stuff in it. All that stuff's the result of 10 years of me getting by with cheap gear before purchasing high-end equipment. Spent a lot of time figuring out that this was what I wanted to do before I dropped money on it. It's also the result of me spending like pretty much every birthday, Father's Day, and Christmas list hint on things that I wanted for my fly fishing, my fly fishing wardrobe. On the right is me a few years into my fly fishing journey, with a rod that my dad gave me, some dollar store hemostats clipped onto the front of a baby carrier, and our daughter, who would often be asleep in the backpack. I didn't own waders at this point in time. And the first pair that I ever had were leaky hand-me-downs that a fellow Trout Unlimited chapter board member gave me. So you don't need all the latest and greatest stuff. The most important thing is to be comfortable. If you're not comfortable, and you're not safe, you're not going to have a good time. You're probably not going to stay out there long. I personally love fishing in the winter. It's beautiful. You're often alone. That's probably because it was 15 degrees out, when I took this photo, and everyone else is still trying to shovel their driveways. My early fly fishing gear probably wouldn't have kept me on the water long in these conditions. But to be honest, I probably wasn't going to stay on the water in these conditions early in my fly fishing journey anyways. I just didn't have the bug yet. So get the gear that will keep you comfortable for long enough to catch the fly fishing bug. If you do, at that point in time, you'll be more educated about what you want to do in the sport of fly fishing, and you'll make better decisions about the long-term higher end gear that you purchase. Two more photos just to highlight gear. This is my friend Sarah on the left, fishing in the snow with nothing more than muck boots. Sarah owns waders, but she decided to wear muck boots on this day. So muck boots, you can get by with them, right? Fishing a small stream. And then here on the right is my coworker, Jenna Mitchell Beckett. She's fishing in a pair of hip boots that we borrowed from a local Trout Unlimited chapter, and a hand-me-down fishing vest that I know means more to her than any vest that she could ever purchase. It was handed down by somebody special to her. And so just love the gear that you have, appreciate the gear that you have, whatever you have available, and don't get too overwhelmed, and get out there. We could have eaten up this entire time talking about rods and reels. I'm going to do it really quick. I'm going to try to keep it simple. There's many different weight fly rods, and those weight fly rods correlate to different weight fly lines. Heavier rods and heavier lines are for bigger flies and bigger fish. Shorter rods and shorter lines are typically, or shorter rods and lighter rods are typically designed for, tight quarters, small mountain streams, smaller fish. There's exceptions, but heavier rod, bigger fish, lighter rod, smaller fish for the most part. A really good middle ground that most people recommend getting started at is a 9-foot 5 weight. The largest and smallest fish in this presentation either were or very easily could have been caught with a 9-foot 5 weight rod. Reels on most fly rods are just glorified line holders. We don't really use the reel, and we don't really need a sophisticated drag system. So unless you're like getting involved with a specific group of friends that are out chasing large striper, or you want to go into the mountains and chase brooks trout, a 9-foot 5 weight combo is going to get you going. And you could do this for $80 from a place like Bass Pro or Cabela's. If you invest more like 150 or 200 from a brand like Orvis or TFO or Redington, you're going to find yourself with something that might last you a little bit longer and be a little bit higher quality. But there aren't a lot of bad brands out there today. Gear's better than it's ever been. You know yourself and how much free time you have, and how motivated you are to spend time on the water. So think about those things and spend an appropriate amount of money to get something that is going to allow you to understand how much you like it before you spend too much. So gear checklist really quick: comfortable clothing to keep you warm in cold weather, cool in warm weather. Footwear like muck boots, hip boots, waders to keep you dry if you plan to fish in cold weather or particularly cold water. We're at the time of the year where just about anybody anywhere in the watershed, you could be wet wading in a pair of flip-flops. 9-foot 5 weight rod and reel combo, tapered leaders. Didn't get into leaders. It's kind of complicated. A 9-foot 5X leader for trout and panfish, 9-foot 4X through 9-foot 1X for larger fish is a good rule of thumb. And I wouldn't worry a whole lot more about waders until you get to a point where you're bored with everything else you're dealing with and want to explore, more delicate leaders and such. Simple backpack, something to carry extra flies, extra leaders, water, snack, flies. I mentioned polarized sunglasses. It's not on this list. This list could be significantly more complicated, but in my opinion, you should start simple. Worry about all the other variables when you get bored with the variables that you're currently dealing with. There is always a deeper hole to go down with fly fishing, and there's no need to rush into those deeper holes until you're ready for it. So, what do you do next? Our watershed is far too full of beautiful fish and beautiful places that live where those fish live, to not get out there and go see it. Like this beautiful native brook trout that's here on the slide right now. You just don't get to see and develop an appreciation for that stuff unless you get out there. There's never been an easier time to get into fly fishing. Um, fly fishing was founded. Somebody asked this question in registration in like the 2nd century. So for like 1800 years, fly fishing's been around for, and you just happen to be here at the easiest time to get into it. There's never been higher quality and more affordable gear on the market. It's never been more accessible than it currently is. Um, Facebook Marketplace is your friend. Go out there and look for used gear on there. There's 382 Trout Unlimited chapters nationwide. Find a local chapter, attend a meeting, get involved that way. There's groups like United Women on the Fly, who specialize in providing resources and hosting events to encourage anglers of all different types of backgrounds to enjoy fly fishing. The members of these groups likely have gear that they'd be willing to let you borrow, or somebody in those groups would love to take you fishing. Um, and then if you spend a few days on the water in that way on the cheap and you're eager to learn more, hiring a guide isn't a bad idea. Regardless of what you do, ask questions. I made the mistake of not asking enough questions when I was getting started. And I watched other people around me get into fly fishing, and they asked questions. And the way that they grew through the introductory portion of getting into fly fishing was absurd, because they just asked me questions. They asked people in parking lot questions. People in parking lots handed them flies that were working because they asked, and I would have never asked, right? So just ask questions regardless of how you do it. So we're to the question portion. I think I've seen Jenna throwing some questions into the chat here. Um, how how do you know how much slack in the line to hold in your left hand? Yeah, that's a really good question. It just, I guess, a way to know how much to hold is as you become a better caster and your cast becomes more efficient at um, transferring energy from the rod to the line, you're going to notice that if you have a little bit of slack laying at your side in the water, or in your hand, you're going to notice that the line's ready to pull that out of your hand. If your cast isn't there yet, then you're going to notice that there's still a bunch of slack there when the cast is complete. So I think when you spend time on the water, you'll develop the skill sets to know when your cast is ready for more slack to be pulled out of the guides. And you'll develop the confidence to know, okay, there's a rising fish over there, or there's some fishy looking water over there, and I want my line over there. And your hand-eye coordination just gets much better to know this is how much slack I need here in order to get my fly over there. I hope that helps answer your question. Are there left-handed and right-handed rods or reels? The rods are the same, and a lot of reels these days are designed to be able to be flipped back and forth. So if you go to some place like a fly shop to purchase a rod or reel, they're probably going to ask you which way you want it set up. Um, most in most fly fishing, you cast with your dominant hand, and you reel with your non-dominant hand. There's some areas of fly fishing, particularly in the saltwater, where you might where you might fight a fish for a long time, where those guides are going to want you to cast with your dominant hand, transfer the rod to your non-dominant hand, and then reel with your dominant hand because you'll be reeling for a while. But I really don't know that that's going to make a big difference. And most reels are designed to be flipped. So if you're getting one and you think you need to cast or reel left-handed, or cast left-handed and reel right-handed, just make sure you're purchasing a reel that is able to be that's able to be flipped. Let's see. Keep the questions coming if you have them. There are some more questions from registration, and we've got 5 minutes yet. So there are some more questions from registration that I'm going to start answering until more questions roll into the chat. So I mentioned this already. Where did fly fishing originate? I mentioned when it did. The 2nd century is when they think people started mimicking floating insects. All the castings a little bit newer than that, a couple hundred years newer than that, but back to the 2nd century in what is now Rome is where they think people started mimicking floating insects. Can you talk about seasonal differences in where fish, trout or other fish, hold, and how that changes fly selection and presentation? So yeah, that's going to depend on the species, but for the most part, fish are going to feed every day, year round. So they have to be near where the food's at, or they have to at least be close by to it. Yet we don't see fish rising to dry flies, and we don't see stripers swimming around breaking up schools of bait on the surface every day. That means that they're feeding subsurface, and most of the time, right? And so we need to figure out how to get a fly to where they are and get it in front of them. They're not going to move that far for it, so it has to be relatively close to them. For trout, I mentioned this, drifting a nymph that could be underneath of a bobber, or what in the fly fishing world we call an indicator. It could be drifting a nymph underneath of a dry fly so that the dry fly becomes the bobber. But getting that nymph on the bottom of a riffle through spring, summer, fall is going to be an effective way to catch more fish than just about any other form of trout fishing. In the winter, you're going to have to slow that down. Heavier fly, maybe a longer leader, more split shot, and getting it to the bottom of pools because the fish start to slow down, but they still eat. Generally, the warmer the water, the more active the fish are going to be. An important note, we've got a beautiful pectoral fin of a wild brown trout here on this slide. If you're fishing for wild trout, like the one in this photo, and you plan to catch and release them, carry a thermometer. When the water temperature reaches the high 60s and into the 70s, the amount of dissolved oxygen in the water starts to decrease because of the water temperature, and there's just not enough oxygen in the water for trout to revive as we release them. And so we'll release, you could go out and have a 20 fish day and release them all, and you could kill more fish than the person who took 5 fish home on a stringer. So, just think about water temperatures in trout when we get into the high 60s, low 70s. But yeah, in general, just think about where that food source is, regardless of the water type or regardless of the time of year, and you're going to find where the fish are at because they do eat all the time. Somebody asked best places near DC. I personally haven't done a lot of fishing in DC. I do know that there's a Trout Unlimited chapter there called the National Capital Chapter of Trout Unlimited. I was on their website last night, and it's impressive, full of resources. Second, there's a really cool fly shop in Washington, D.C. called District Angling. I'd check it out. Feels like you're walking into like a Montana fly shop. District Angling is very cool. Both of those groups, the TU group and the fly shop, are going to be knowledgeable about the species. But with that being said, The Shad Run in DC at Flesher's Cove is, as far as I know, still very accessible, and approachable in the spring. And then the Potomac has, and its tributaries have striped bass, largemouth bass, both perch, yellow and white perch, and snakehead. So there's options there. But check out those two resources for more information. Does Virginia have any good fly fishing guides for seniors new to fly fishing? I don't have a ton of experience with guides in Virginia, but I'm sure that there are guides that are willing to customize trips for you. I know personally that Mossy Creek fly fishing in Virginia has a great reputation. There's also a guide that I follow on Instagram. His name's Wesley Hodges. I've never met him in person, but I interact with him on Instagram, and he seems like a really cool guy. Does a lot of float trips for smallmouth bass. I would check out Wesley Hodges. He's doing some overnight trips now too, which seems very cool, like a very Western style overnight float trip would just be awesome. And then also I noticed that we have a conservation chairman for the Northern Virginia Trout Unlimited chapter registered here for this webinar, and I spent some time on their website. That's an impressive website, and they have a lot of good resources, and it looks like they do some what they call fish with a member days. So you can go out with them and fish with one of their members. So if you're in Virginia, I'd recommend checking out the Northern Virginia chapter of Trout Unlimited. How do you find new spots to fish? That one came in through the chat. Almost out of time here, but I'm going to burn through a few more. Most state agencies like the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission or your agency within your state, Department of Natural Resources and such, they're going to have maps. Like just last week, as I was preparing to go fishing in central PA over the long weekend, I was looking at a map and I was looking at every little blue line that came into this big piece of water we were going to be fishing, every little tributary. And I referenced every one of those tributaries to the list that Pennsylvania has of wild trout water. And every one of those little blue lines was on that list that it either held wild brown trout or brook trout. And I went up one of them and caught some brook trout up one of them. So the agencies have lists of water that is certain regulations, and I see we've got folks putting the Maryland Fly Fishing Trail is a good call. That's here in the chat. Definitely check that out, because that's legitimately giving you spots to go check out. And so yeah, I would definitely check that out. But check out the state agencies, call a guide, call a shop. The shops are always willing to help out. Let's see. I'm gonna do one more here that was registration, because I think it's an important one, and then we'll wrap up with it. I'm intimidated to walk out to the river for the first time with other anglers around. How should I handle this? So I am so glad that somebody was brave enough to ask this question. Uh, Fly fishing is for everyone. Our watershed is full of public access fishing locations that we all have a right to enjoy. If this question is in relation to feeling unsafe on the water by yourself, which I totally understand if that's the case, I would encourage you to connect with a Trout Unlimited group, or a group like United Women on the Fly, to find a fishing buddy, um, and get out there with somebody. I know many of the women from United Women on the Fly, and they're all willing to they're all just dying to find other women to get on the water with. And Trout Unlimited groups, the folks there are always looking for people to fish with. So get in touch with a group, go to some meetings. I see we've got an offer here in the chat to take someone out anytime. So there you go. And I'd be happy to as well. I mean, I'm always looking for folks to fish with. So if your questions in relation to feeling like you aren't confident enough in your own angling skills to fit in on the water, then I would try to overcome that by knowing that everyone else started somewhere. Practice in your backyard if you need to get to that point. If you're having a hard time with it, still go fishing during a time of the day or week when not many other people are there. Go to a lake or a pond and practice your casting skills there as well. I'll note that many people do go fly fishing to get away from crowds or the hustle and bustle of their daily lives and spend time alone. Um, I've had very few encounters though with anglers that come fish closer to me than I prefer them to be fishing closer to me. Unless it's like opening day here in Pennsylvania, which is crazy. For the most part, people keep their distance. I can also usually tell when somebody is interested in engaging with me and when they're not. They'll make eye contact or they'll keep their head down. They want to just fish. They don't want to talk. So we don't talk. When I do talk to people on the water, they are some of the best people that I know. All my friends are fly anglers. And when you bump into somebody who does seem like they want to talk, ask them questions because I'm sure they have information to share. And I wouldn't be too concerned about those people being the type of people that you don't want to talk to. I think that they're probably friendly, and I think that they probably want to share information with you. We've got some great resources here in the chat. I would recommend going back and snagging some of those links that people have been posting. Thank you so much for all of the activity in the chat today. With that being said, that is the end of today's Ask the Alliance presentation. Thank you so much for joining us. Following this call, you're going to receive an email with a link to watch this recording. The recording will also be posted to Facebook after we turn off the live stream. So if you have any questions, please feel free to get in touch with us through that email that we're going to send. We love talking to anglers, and I would love to talk to all of you. I've got my contact information up on the screen here. Please feel free to snag that and reach out. So with that being said, from myself and on behalf of the Alliance for the Chesapeake Bay, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate your time and hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we hope to see you again at an upcoming Ask the Alliance.